well, lots of things are interesting about your new book.
Mhm.
But one of the things that you seem to expand more into is this discussion of the other area of where persons get talked about a lot in philosophy, which is in the ethical sphere, usually in discussions of like animal rights and abortion. That is, what counts as the kind of thing that might have rights, or that it might be that we owe duties to, or that it would be wrong to kill, and so on. And you want to bring those two issues together and this is your person life view. And you say some things that are fairly controversial, I would have thought, in that section. So, for example, you suggest that it might be you can defend a view where, say, somebody like very small infants or very impaired individuals, possibly PBS individuals, possibly not, could count as persons, whereas E.T. maybe doesn't.
Oh, no, E.T. does.
Okay, but you did imagine, say, a super intelligent dog then, that where you wanted to say that it's possible that they don't.
No, the super intelligent dog is a person, Mr. Peabody.
Right, Mr. Peabody. But you wanted to
No,
qualify
if you're
that.
super intelligent, you get to be of a certain kind, what we call super intelligent anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he can. I mean, we better be nice to him if he can make time machines.
Exactly.
But well, lay out the person life view.
Yeah. So I mean, right there, what I'm struggling to do in the parts you're talking about is to say. I mean, I have to make the point that all humans are born in a culture are automatically persons. But I don't want to, so there it begins to sound like what makes you a person is just your biological endowment. But I want to say, no, really, I still maintain a distinction between person and human animal. And that's where I get Mr. Peabody in, and I'm trying to show how I can have it both ways. And that's why you were confused, because it's confusing. So, well, I don't know if you were confused, but it seems like you thought I might have tried to exclude these people.
Well, perhaps, I mean, the better example is you were a little concerned with, you wanted to say that certainly someone who is a severely impaired infant, say, is definitely a person, but not our pets. So
right,
not Mr. Peabody, but, a regular dumb dog.
Right, exactly. So maybe I should start at the beginning. So I think of it as there being sort of, two moments at which I realized that something very different needed to be said in my, one corresponding to each book. So the first one was Parfit saying this psychological view isn't going to work, and there doesn't seem to be a kind of unity of consciousness of the sort that would do what we're hoping for it to do. And then I was trying to see if I could come up with that. Then the second moment was reading Eric Olson, and there are many animalists and many proponents of animalism. It just so happened, that I read Eric Olson, and he lays it out very, very clearly in a way that was a challenge. So in some ways, when I first read Olson's book, I thought,
the first one or the What Are We?
The first one, I'm sorry.
The human animal, yeah.
What I thought is he's saying the same thing I said in the Constitution of Selves, only he's coming at it from the metaphysical perspective. Because I made that distinction between the re-identification question and the characterization question. And at that point, I said, if you want to answer the re-identification question, it's probably going to be in terms of something to do with biology and identifying the same human body. But the characterization question is the one we're really after, and I'm going to answer that with narrative. And so Olson, too, comes out saying the real problem in the discussion, in a very different way, and a very helpful way, says the real problem in the discussion of personal identity is that people haven't distinguished practical concerns from metaphysical concerns. Why in the world should a metaphysical account of personal identity have anything to do with our human practices or what we care about at all. It's just a fact about the world, and that will be different from these things we care about. And if you're a real metaphysician, that's the one you're really interested in. But then he raises some really, I think, very compelling challenges to any psychological account of personal identity. So you go back to when I was talking about the narrative view. What I said is, well, when you challenged me and said, how can you constitute yourself? Doesn't the thing have to be in place? There was a time before it was there. And I say, well, you've got this infant, and the infant has a brain, and the infant has parents, and the parents talk to the infant, and the brain changes, and then you get a person out of that. And then what I read Olson is doing, among many other things, is saying, well, so what's the metaphysical status of that person? What's the ontological status of that person? Is that a thing? Because what you're telling me now is that there's this human being, right, or human animal, as you would have it, an infant, who gains some kind of, who gains some kind of capacities, cognitive capacities, and then a new thing comes into existence. I mean, that makes no sense. What happened to the old thing? Where's the human then? Is it still there, or is it not there? If it's not there, you're telling me that something went out of existence and something completely materially coincident with it suddenly popped into existence when this thing learned to narrate. That's pretty weird. And then if it loses the capacity to narrate, does it pop out of existence again? And another, that's just very strange. Or suppose you want to say now there's a second thing, the person. So you've got the human, and now the second thing comes to existence, the person. And he says, well, then, what's the connection between the two? There are two coincident beings, and which one is talking and which one is thinking, and why wouldn't they both, So he's got all these arguments that show it's pretty metaphysically awkward to say that a person is an entity, an object, a substance, and that it's not identical to a human animal.
See, I think Trinitarians could handle this issue fairly straightforwardly. I mean, if you're a committed Christian who believes God in three persons, you shouldn't really be this worried by these metaphysical issues.
Well, you might be worried, though, if we're like that, because God's pretty special. But also, you might be willing to say it was a mystery if you were a Trinitarian, in a way that I guess Olson is not willing to say it's a mystery.
It's not mysterious at all.
But it's true. I mean, there are many who would oppose animalism in something like that way, and saying it's not so strange. There are ways in which these two coincident beings can both be present.
Yeah, and it's a little. I haven't, I'm sure this has been discussed and I haven't really followed up on it, but it seems like someone like David Lewis has something of a response, because he can say there is one thing existing, it's just that thing is part of two different things. So, for example, this is one thing right now, but from a four-dimensional point of view, you can see it's like a section that is part of two freeways. Is it the 475? Yes. Is it the 75? Yes. They just happen, but is it just one section of road? Yes. It's just...
Well, except that it doesn't split. I mean, that one is a proper subset of the other.
Well, unless we imagine, the person continuing in heaven or something like that.
True enough. So he does just reject four-dimensionalism. I mean, so Olson makes a lot of metaphysical assumptions. He just rejects four-dimensionalism.
Well, he gives some in his more recent one. I know he gives some arguments, but it's the usual discussion that you get in that metaphysical realm.
And it's brief. I mean, he says you've got to start somewhere. I mean, he reasonably says you need to start. You can't fight all these battles.
Right.
So he accepts that. He accepts a very strong form of essentialism. There are bare particulars in the world, and each one belongs to one and only one kind, essentially. It has one and only one substance concept.
Yeah, and he seems drawn to Van Inwagen's view where there are basically, basic components and then lives.
Right.
organisms. And the idea that an organism could be isn't an organism just as questionable a concept, if not more so, than anything we're dealing with here? I mean,
Well, I certainly think so.
are my cells separate organisms and yet they're part of me and all that business? I mean,
Right.
it's
What about the bacteria in your
right,
gut and
right. How
your
much of this is me? And if you replace it with plastic, according to him, it ceases to be me. But what if it's independent? Why does it cease to be me? Because it's not alive. Well, then you get into the issue of what's alive, and that hasn't been settled. So there's a
right?
million
So
different
he
issues.
makes many assumptions. There are many places to get off the bus with him.
But
But what?
but we can't. I shouldn't be challenging Olson when I'm not talking to Olson.
Yeah, you
So
should talk to
yeah, I
him.
should
You don't
challenge you.
set this right. But really, the part that got to me that seemed like a righteous criticism. Well, there's sort of two things that led me to the second book. One is the Olson thing, and I've got another story too, because he told me I had to have anecdotes, so I'll give you another one. It's not yeah. So, um, so one is just it seemed to me right that there, however you think of entities or substances or whatever, there's something funny about saying that a new thing pops into existence when we learn to be self-narrators. That's sort of questionable. And then the other thing that had been in the back of my mind for a really long time is this panel I had been on quite a while ago with that was arranged, at the Berman Institute at Hopkins, which was really helpful, although it didn't seem so at the time, that had philosophers of personal identity describing their views of personal identity and how they applied to fictionalized clinical cases in neurology. And then there were clinical neurologists there as well. And there was a lot of crosstalk at that point. But one of the neurologists sort of said, hey, look, according to all of you guys, because we all had these good, psychological accounts of identity with Lockean conceptions of personhood, he said, according to you guys, none of my patients is a person. And we said, well, yes, it's true. That is what we think, but don't take it as
Guilty.
Put them on an ice floe to die. And we're like, oh, no, it has nothing to do with them dying. And it's an honorific and it's a, technical term in philosophy. And, they can be very, very nice individuals. They're just not persons. And, and the more I said it, the more I thought, this is just not true, right? These are people, right? That it wasn't just, of course you can have a technical term, and of course the Lockean notion of personhood describes something that's important to us and that's useful to think about and so on. And of course, you can use your terms technically in whatever way you want. But it seemed to me that something substantial was being missed in limiting personhood to this very narrow set of attributes and to this very narrow range of individuals. And I know, Hillary Putnam once told me when I was writing my thesis, he said, so you mean an infant isn't a person? I said, no. And he said, you'll change your mind when you have kids. I didn't immediately. I was too tired. But I mean, that sort of, semi-ethical consideration, I don't know how to characterize it, humanistic consideration, together with Olson's metaphysical challenge, made me think there is something wrong with the narrative account of personhood as, really the story of what it is to be a person. And there had been problems before, people would raise questions like, well, just with sort of very garden variety forms of mental illness, the narrative conceptions start sort of falling apart and people start falling out of personhood who shouldn't fall out of personhood in my mind. So,
well,
basically go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. We get into this in philosophy an awful lot. I mean, and you kind of inveigh against it in your new book. We love necessary and sufficient conditions because it's like our party trick. It's what we're good at, and we're good at pointing out when they're not met because people seem to think. And certainly we demand necessary and sufficient conditions in like the law. there needs to be a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what is pornography if you're going to regulate it. Or, it certainly gets challenged, and we try to settle what those are if it comes up for debate. But it looks more and more like something like a person. What we have in mind is an archetype, and we want it sort of to spread out and cover, things close enough. Maybe this is what Wittgenstein means by language, by game, his notion of games. But we want it to spread out and cover the ones that are close enough, but then we don't want it to cover too much, so the boundaries get vague. But what you don't want to do, it seems like when you talk about the person life in your new book, that you really, it looks like at first that it's dangerously conventionalist, and of course you acknowledge this and say, no, my view isn't conventionalist because of this, and this, because of course what we worry about is that if we give too much power to the culture, there are bad cultures, and as you say, we can have a culture that doesn't acknowledge certain humans as full persons and so on. So you want to block that, but at the same time, someone who is a campaigner for the rights of non-humans, animal rights campaigner as they're usually called, would have problems with your trying to draw a line between human beings as persons when comparably talented non-humans, like our pets, are not.
Right.
So what's your quick response to that?
So the quick response to that is, although I try to connect the notion of being a person to practical considerations in a quite direct way, it's less direct than some others, right? So being a person does mean you're the kind of being about whom certain kinds of questions are raised and certain kinds of expectations exist. But seeing someone as a person does not mean respecting them or treating them well or anything like that. It might mean you should. I don't enter into those questions. I don't really do any of that kind of prescriptive ethics. So one of the examples I give when I say, so one of the claims I make is that all cultures, so just to go back up one step, in response to the earlier problems, I wanted to include infants. I wanted to include people with dementia. The way I did that was to say, look at a person roughly over the course of a whole life. To be a person is to be an individual who has the expectation of and therefore does live a certain kind of life, and the life is roughly, the paradigm of it is roughly that of a human in a culture. And what that means is from infancy, you're brought into the practices of a person life, the kind of life a person lives, and scaffolded up to being a mature person who's a Lockean person in the ordinary course of events, and then very frequently loses some of the capacities that would make you a Lockean person. So a lot depends on the culture recognizing you, right? Your social cultural infrastructure recognizing you as a person, and that's how we get into the problems you described. So one objection, now to do the quick part, is, well, what about cultures that see whole groups of humans as non-persons? And the example I give there, I go back to this point that to see someone as a person is to see them as the kind of being who could live this kind of life, which roughly involves being someone who will perpetuate and contribute to and live within the cultural infrastructure. Being a person doesn't mean treating someone nicely. And so the example I give, sort of borrowing from my advisor, Stanley Cavell, is what about people who say, well, in the antebellum South, slave holders didn't see their slaves as persons? And I say, well, let's look at the slave codes, which prevent slaves from possessing anti-slavery literature, testifying in court, entering into contracts. You didn't see stuff like that about the horses or the cows.
Well,
right?
they did used to have pigs on trial. Remember, there are
It's
cases
true.
where they put. But
It
yes,
is
I mean,
true.
it's the master-slave problem that, they want, you want to dominate these person, but at the same
Right. The
time,
slave
they
has to
have
be
to
a
they
person.
have to be capable of acknowledging you, and then if they're capable of acknowledging you, then yeah,
And what I say is, look, and it's not just contingent that these laws are there. So basically what I'm saying is, look, the slaveholders are seeing the slaves as persons because they see that they could read, they could get married, they could own firearms and shoot them, they could rebel against them. And it's not just coincidental or accidental that they did it, because if they didn't, they'd have had a hard time keeping the institution of slavery going. Because clearly these were people who were capable of all of those things, and needed to be forcibly kept from doing them. So, so the answer about what if you don't treat people, what if you don't treat humans who have the ordinary capacities of a human being as persons? Does that make them non-persons? What I want to say is it's just really not possible for us to see humans as non-persons. It's hard to see how that could work in a culture.
yeah,
In the sense of non-person that I'm talking about.
right. I mean, certainly there have been cultures where people who were born deformed were put out to die. So they're, and of course, slaves' right to life wasn't respected. So, and you can imagine it came to the point where there was this common birth defect where people were born severely intellectually disabled, and they looked differently enough from us that we could dissociate from them, that we could tell some story like they're changelings, right? These people are changelings, we have been cursed by the fairies or whatever, and we get to eat them. You can imagine a culture doing that.
So yes, and I think that's right. So one of the things that I would say, so that is for me the hardest case. So the case of ordinary, typical humans with typical human cognitive capacities and developmental trajectories being treated badly is not for me a case of treating them as non-persons. And you don't have to respect their right to life to treat them as non-persons too. Because like if let's moving from slaves to other atrocities, if you make the enemy defile their sacred texts before you slit their throats,
Right.
you're treating them as a person, because defiling their sacred texts is something peculiar to persons. So that's that one. A And then the other question is, like, say within our culture, let's just take our culture for a minute. How about the human child born with severe cognitive disabilities, so that that child is less cognitively able than the family pet, who also, by the way, we love and take to doggy daycare and pet therapy and, dressing clothes and sports jerseys and things. Why aren't we making the pet a person? And how could we make the cognitively disabled infant who can't even do any of those things a person, right? Just by taking her to the doctor and, dressing her in sports jerseys and things. And my answer to that is, first of all, that there's some sleight of hand even in just directly comparing the cognitive capacities of the two. They just have different kinds of cognitive capacities. So to say that, in some ways, the pet can be left alone. The pet could probably survive on its own. The cognitively disabled infant couldn't. So there, what I want to say is, a lot of things. One thing I want to say is that the role of embodiment is pretty important, in my view. It's, of course, not essential, because things are embodied differently. If they have the right cognitive capacities, could also be persons. But the fact that, this individual is flesh of our flesh and eats the same thing we do and is in the same temper, right? All of those things. I quote, Shylock, right? These play a role. I mean, we don't on a one-off. So part of what I'm saying is, look, you become a person by being recognized as a person by the social cultural infrastructure. So we haven't yet gotten to your hard thing now.
But on the other hand, that culture has a duty to recognize the right things. And it can't not recognize if you meet a certain
I don't even say it's a duty. I say it's just, right?
An intellectual duty?
What?
An intellectual duty? It has to...
Maybe, right. Okay, let's say an intellectual duty. I mean, maybe it is a moral duty, too. I just don't pronounce on that. So I think that... So in the case, so partly here I go Wittgensteinian a little bit, at least as I understand Wittgenstein.
Never go full Wittgenstein.
So two things I would say is, one, in putting the social cultural infrastructure into place, we cannot recognize persons on a case-by-case basis. It's just not feasible, right? There are certain kinds of individuals who get brought into, you're really... and here I use some of the work of Hilda Lindemann, in some ways bringing, the unborn child into personhood if you're planning to have it and raise it before it's even born and before you know anything about its individual cognitive capacities or anything like that. You're preparing the way for it. And so what I say is the way in which we recognize a child with, severe cognitive deficits who, Hilda Lindemann gives the example of her own sister who was born, hydrocephalic in an age when they couldn't do much about it and lived just 18 months and sort of never really gained any milestones. The difference, the way in which we treat that individual as a person and not the family pet can be seen in the different reactions we have to that fact. So the example I give is if you tell human parents that their human child is never going to be able to speak or feed herself or tie her shoes, this is considered, right, a tragedy.
Whereas it wouldn't be for the pet.
What?
Whereas
it wouldn't be for the pet. If you say, look, your poodle puppy never going to be able to learn to speak English or hold a job or eat with a knife and fork, you're going to say, okay, right? And so, what I say is if you organized a walk to find the cause and cure for the first, that would be noble. If you organized a walk to find the cause and cure of why your poodle puppy is never going to be able to speak or hold a job or do elementary mathematics, you've made a mistake. And that's a real mistake. But I haven't talked about your hard case yet.
Well, so and you do want to be careful that you don't, by fiat, settle issues like abortion and removing people from life support machines, just by saying that they're of the type that you don't do that to.
I just say they're of the type that are persons. Now, what I do think is the case is that we have kinds of debates about whether it's okay to terminate human pregnancies or remove humans from life support that we don't have about other
So sometimes it's okay to kill persons.
I do not say anything about that, but the view is silent on it, right? So, I think I would say probably yes. But there's a lot of qualification behind that. And part of the Wittgensteinian bit of my view, I guess, is to say, yes, we love binary decisions in philosophy. You're either a person or a non-person. But although it's a terrible term, there are degenerate cases of personhood. We recognize that a fetal person is relevantly different in many ways from a mature person, and some people think that difference is relevant in the sense that it's enough to allow terminating pregnancy. Other people don't. That's a really hard debate. But saying that, I do not think that acknowledging personhood in the way I do resolves that debate. I did have a moment of terror where I thought that it did, where I wrote a chapter and said, oh no, I've just said that, abortion is immoral or something, but it doesn't. But for it to have practical consequences without going that far is tricky.
Yeah, the other thing you said that was worth discussing is you one of the ways you defended yourself against against conventionalism is you said, well, look, this isn't as if I'm saying a cabal of intellectual leaders gets together and hammers out policy. It's much more organic than that. It emerges, but that has a downside too, because if we had a good cabal of us guys, the philosopher, well, no, not us guys, but a good well, I mean, like the ideal set of, I don't know, Rawlsian parties in the original position or something, then shouldn't we have more confidence in the standards of that society than ones that have just emerged at random and produced strange quirks?
Well, but we beings who do philosophy and can be Rawlsians emerged, right? So that's all I
But
mean.
in very specific circumstances and not in all cultures necessarily.
That is correct. So you think that it would be better?
No, I'm not saying it would be better. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no. So here's the thought experiment. But is the thought experiment about whether we should trust them more about what things are persons?
Yeah, I mean, I am. You seem to have a rather sanguine view of human cultures, that we sort of muddle through and we produce that the attitudes we have, like to babies, we love babies, and and things like that, are going to be the right ones, and that in some sense, I mean, do you want to tell some story? It seems like you sort of hint at a kind of evolutionary view of that cultures that didn't have the right kind of views about what counted as persons have just vanished from the earth because they killed each other or something.
Well, so I mean, the right kind of view, I don't know what the right kind of view is, right? So I'm not. I mean, I think there's plenty of room for thinking about how we ought to treat other people and whether we're doing it right. And also for how we ought to treat things that aren't other people but are awfully nice, like,
cows,
spiders and giraffes and and for how we ought to treat the environment and a lot of other things, right? So my response, I guess, to what you said is something like this. It's less that I think these cultures have the right attitude towards what's a person, as that's just what a person is. So let me try to say what I mean. One way of, one sort of sound bitey way, trying many ways to think of how to, encapsulate what I'm trying to do in this book. And one way of putting it that is not entirely accurate, but sort of gets at the ideas. So the Lockean view of persons distinguishes persons from humans by saying, what's special about us, right? Humans are animals like other animals. But then there's something special and distinctive about us. And special doesn't necessarily have to be good, right? It's just special. It's distinctive. Let's not say special. Let's say distinctive. What is distinctive? And for Locke, that's our capacity for reflective self-consciousness, as it is for many other people, our capacity for moral agency, right? Rationality, prudential concern, and so on. And what I want to say is, yeah, all those things are distinctive of us, but there's something more basic that's distinctive of us, something that depends on the fact that we mature to have those capacities, but on which those capacities themselves also depend. And that is that we live in cultures. Now, of course, the question of what constitutes a culture is not an easily settled one, but roughly a culture has social infrastructure, maybe religious beliefs, educational systems by which knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation, codified codes of conduct, and so on, for good or ill, right? I'm not saying they're right, but that's what a culture is. And what I want to say is, once we do that, once we live in a culture, once we acculturate, all kinds of ways of life become possible for us that were not previously, that are not possible without cultural and social infrastructure. And for beings like humans, at least, there seems to be good evidence that, in fact, with the development of culture, all kinds of possibilities for, physiological, well, we know that all kinds of physiological changes happen when you enculturate, just because diet changes and activity level changes and, right, ways of life change. So over time, all kinds of basic biological features change. And moreover, there seems to be evidence that, a lot of evidence that what happens to you when you live in a culture changes your brain architecture in your youth in a way that, if you're a feral child or whatever, it never happens. So that, for me, is my account of what it is to be a person, is to live within that kind of structure. And one of the features of the structure is that it tends to develop beings who have the Lockean capacities, because without that you couldn't have culture, because that's what does all the codifying and infrastructure building and so on. So then the idea would be, sure, that codifying could be morally pernicious, or that codifying might be morally good. So in terms of being good or evil, like about how you should treat other people, that's an open question. But the question of who you should treat as a person, I think, has very strong biological constraints on it for us within the culture, the social cultural infrastructure. That to have a culture in which you thought, say, that all human babies were changelings and should be killed, that culture would die out pretty quickly. Now, the question whether you could think that, the half who had this very common deformity were non-persons, that's a harder question for me. And I think that what I would have to do on that is just bite the bullet and say, yes, if there really were such a culture, and really these things were, thrown off to die with no religious ceremony or, burial, or nobody crying about it, except for the fact that my bad luck to have a changeling, then those humans would not be persons. Now, is the society right to see them as non-persons? And can we ask that question? That's harder for me. I don't know what to say about that, honestly. But it's a very extreme case. I mean, what I'm saying is, look, you can't have a society in which you think all girls are non-persons and kill them all. Not without a lot of, chemicals to produce eggs or something.
You could have a culture where it was sort of preordained that you only have one child. I mean, I'm not thinking of China because that's an official policy, but, where it was the view that everything after the first child were, demon beings that would grow up to destroy the first child or something, so you have to kill them.
It's not clear to me that's really imaginable, I guess. So, I mean, and there, that's no argument, right? To say it's not clear to me that that's really imaginable. And so there I have to do one of two things. I either have to rely on the thing you said before, which is to say, and so part of what I'm saying is that person is a sort of a cluster concept, and there isn't a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, and then, that whole, all the dangers attendant on that. Or I just have to say, yeah.
Enough with the crazy.
Well, any philosophical position, you're going to be able to come up with a hard case. I mean, the case you come up with, I don't really think it's imaginable, but I can't say that it isn't, and it's not crazy. I mean, it's not like, the Parfitian splitting your brain in two and working on two math problems, right?
Yeah, you're not in a field where you can object to crazy examples.
So I think that at that point, I just have to say that would be a hard case for me, and I can't answer all the hard cases.
Right.
But I hope that, at least the change of direction is fruitful.